All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're exploring how a terrifying ancient epidemic didn't just ravage populations, but fundamentally shaped modern medicine, human behavior, and even our understanding of medical ethics. We're talking about the history of syphilis, a disease that, for centuries, was completely shrouded in mystery, stigma, and just sheer terror. Just imagine encountering a brand new disease so horrific that, as scholar Jared Diamond pointed out, it literally caused flesh to fall from people's faces. In its early days, this was a much more lethal version of the disease than what we know today. It was a rapid, agonizing death sentence, and nobody, absolutely nobody, had any idea how to stop it. Section 1. The 1495 European Outbreak, the sudden explosion of a deadly new plague. So, our historical detective story kicks off in 1495, right during the French invasion of Naples, Italy. When King Charles VIII of France led his troops, which actually included Spanish mercenaries, into Italy, they brought something terrible with them. And as those troops eventually dispersed and headed back to their respective homes, this highly lethal, incredibly contagious disease swept across the continent like wildfire. It left an absolute week of devastation, resulting in up to 5 million deaths. I mean, it was a massive killer during the Renaissance.
But here's the thing. Trying to track the true origins of this plague proved exceptionally difficult. For centuries, it was famously known as the Great Imitator. Because it presents such a vast, chaotic variety of symptoms, it confused even the sharpest medieval medical minds. Doctors often misdiagnosed it as leprosy or elephantiasis or scabies. And because of this uncanny ability to mimic other ailments, it didn't even have its own universally recognized name for a very long time, which makes tracking its history incredibly murky.
Section 2. Solving a historical mystery. Columbian versus pre-Columbian origins. Now, this murkiness led directly to a massive decades-long scientific debate over where this terrible disease actually came from. Scientists were deeply split between two major theories. On one hand, you had the Columbian hypothesis, which argued that Columbus and his crew brought the disease back to Europe from the Americas in the 1490s. On the other hand, the pre-Columbian hypothesis argued that no, the disease had actually always existed in Europe in hiding but was just misdiagnosed as leprosy or went totally unrecognized because of its great imitator qualities. If we consider the clues that initially supported the pre-Columbian theory, they're pretty compelling. Paleopathologists started finding ancient European bones and teeth with highly suspicious damage. We're talking about adolescents in ancient Italy, dating all the way back to 580 BC, showing distinct dental deformities. A 6th century skeleton in the UK with typical skull and long bone damage, a 13th century skeleton in Turkey, and a 15th century one in Gloucester, England, all showing widespread bone lesions. So this physical evidence strongly suggested the bacteria was already hanging around Europe way before Columbus ever set sail. But as science advanced, the true answer was actually locked away in DNA. Modern genetic and skeletal evidence conclusively solved this mystery. Researchers found a 9,900-year-old skeleton of a woman in a Mexican cave on the Yucatan Peninsula that showed clear inflammation caused by this specific family of bacteria. And even more definitively, advanced phylogenetic analyses, which is essentially tracing the evolutionary family tree of the bacteria, including a massive 2024 study in the journal Nature, trace the origins strictly back to the Americas. So, despite all those confusing medieval bones, advanced genome sequencing confirms the disease absolutely originated in the Americas and arrived in Europe precisely during the Columbian Exchange. Section 3. The Naming Blame Game. Xenophobia and the French Disease. Looking at the geopolitical fallout of this outbreak gives us some incredible and honestly kind of dark psychological insight into human nature. When a horrific, sexually transmitted disease suddenly appears out of nowhere, nobody wants to take credit for it, right? This brilliantly illustrates the inherent xenophobia of the era. Every single nation just pointed the finger at their political or military rivals. The Italians, they called it the French disease. The French naturally fired back and called it the Italian disease. The Dutch, who were fighting a war of independence against the Spanish Habsburgs, called it the Spanish disease. The Russians blamed the Polish, and the Turks blamed the Christians. It was just a magnificent, tragic display of international finger-pointing driven by fear and political spite. It actually wasn't until 1530 that the disease got its modern, relatively neutral name. An Italian physician and poet named Girolamo Fracastoro wrote a poem in Latin about a fictional, defiant shepherd named Syphilis. In the story, this shepherd was the very first man to contract the disease, sent as a punishment by the sun god Apollo for his defiance. Well, The name stuck, and syphilis slowly replaced that vast array of xenophobic titles. Section 4, Bizarre and Dangerous Treatments. Desperate measures for a desperate disease. With the disease ravaging the population and severely disfiguring its victims, physicians and patients alike were in a state of sheer panic. When you track the timeline of medical treatments, you really see humanity's desperate evolution. For hundreds of years, treatments involved literal poison or entirely useless wood saps. It wasn't until 1910 that an arsenic-based drug called salvarsan, developed by Sahachiro Hata, finally offered some true antimicrobial relief. Then we see the wild introduction of malaria therapy in the 1920s, which is just fascinating, and we'll get into it in a second. Finally, the nightmare basically ended with the mass production of the antibiotic penicillin in 1943, which allowed the disease to be effectively and reliably cured. Let's zoom in on those early centuries for a second, because it's pretty wild. For hundreds of years, patients basically had to choose between two primary, terrible options. First up was mercury. It was rubbed right on the skin or even vaporized over a fire in a box that patients sat inside. The goal here was to make the patient heavily salivate to somehow expel the disease. Instead, it was highly toxic, causing awful gum ulcers and literally making patients' teeth fall out. The other option was guaiacum wood from Hispaniola. Administered as a hot drink, it was totally ineffective, but it was incredibly popular among the European elite, simply because the wood came from the Americas. The logic being that God would naturally put the cure in the exact same geographic location where the disease originated. Now get this, exactly one Nobel Prize in medicine has been awarded for a treatment for this disease. Just one. In 1927, Julius Wagner-Jauregg won it for discovering that if you intentionally infected late-stage neurosyphilis patients with malaria, it would induce extremely high prolonged fevers. This form of pyrotherapy essentially cooked the syphilis bacteria right out of the body. Once the syphilis was cured by the fever, doctors would just step in and treat the malaria with quinine. It was an absolutely extreme measure. But hey, it worked well enough to win a Nobel Prize before antibiotics came along. Section 5. Failures in Medical Ethics. The Dark Realities of Modern Medical Research. As we shift gears into the 20th century, we really must objectively examine how the scientific pursuit of understanding this disease led to some of the most devastating ethical failures in modern history. The Tuskegee syphilis study stands as a stark, undeniable tragedy. Backed by the U.S. government, the study began in 1932 to measure how untreated syphilis progressed in Black men. But the absolute darkest moment came in 1947. Even after penicillin was proven to be a safe, effective, and widely available cure, researchers purposefully withheld it from the subjects just so they could continue tracking the disease's deadly progression. It took a whistleblower named Peter Buxton going to the press in 1972 for the study to finally be shut down. And the U.S. government didn't even issue a formal apology to the survivors until 1997. We see this same terrible breach of medical ethics in the Guatemala studies. Between 1946 and 1948, doctors sponsored by the United States government deliberately infected highly vulnerable populations in Guatemala. We're talking soldiers, prisoners, and mental patients with syphilis and other diseases. This was conducted entirely without the informed consent of the subjects, simply to test antibiotic treatments. This staggering ethical violation resulted in yet another formal apology from the U.S. government decades later, in October 2010. Ultimately, looking back at this long, dark history leaves us with a vital question. What do the horrors, the bizarre cures, and the ethical failures of this historical pandemic teach us about human nature today? From the xenophobic finger-pointing of the 1500s, to the desperate drinking of poisonous mercury, to the egregious betrayal of patient trust in the 20th century, this bacteria didn't just test our immune systems, it tested our humanity. How we react to the unknown, who we choose to blame, and the ethical lines we cross in the name of science are all deeply woven into this story. It's an explainer of the past, for sure, but it serves as a profound warning for our future. Thanks for diving into this with me, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.